feet are like ice as a warm breeze blows over me. The discomfort reminds me to appreciate those fleeting moments.
What I want to talk about today is something that I don't often get to talk about this much at the last opening. And what I want to talk about today are actually the people that I've met when traveling in Africa. The artists, designers, creatives, whatever you want to call them. And so I'm going to share a few stories of what creatives are really like. And so here are a few of the hidden stories that I found over the last few years. This is Alibis. He's a Ghanaian artist. And I found out about Alibis when I was studying African arts. He's one of sort of the most famous artists at the moment. His work is in the Met in New York. He did the entrance to the Venice Biennale a few years ago. And his work looks like this. It's these hanging sculptures. But curators in the United States and Europe have called his work recycled. They call it recycled sculptures, recycled installations, because he uses found materials, in Nigeria. So he uses found bottle caps, bottle tops, sort of metals that you can incorporate into his work. And I believe that if Anatsui was not African, his work would have been called Neo-Dada or collage or any number of other things, but because of where it comes from, he's sort of been limited to recycle. So that's the entrance to the Venice Biennale. And what he's done is created textiles out of these materials. So West Africa has a huge textile culture, and Ghana, where he's from, is famous for their kente cloths, and so he's recreated that. And these actually great, although they're made out of metal, and it's always interesting when a museum purchases one of these because they call him and they frantically say, how do we install it? What did you mean for us to do with it? And he sort of says, well, I don't really care. It's a fabric, do with it what you want, hang it how you want to, install it where you want. And so that often throws off a lot of us museum people who know that artists have a very specific vision for their work. This is an exhibition by Seyi Keita, who's no longer with us. He's probably Africa's most famous and iconic photographer. His work was discovered in the 1990s. And a friend of his explains that Keita would have never shown his images in the ways that we show them in museum galleries now. So in the 1950s, Keita had a photo studio in Mali's capital, Bamako. And Bamako at the time was sort of a major hub for French West Africa. And people from all over the region migrated there. And in his studio, Keita had all sorts of props, radios, watches, and things that evoked contemporary times. So people would come to have their picture taken with these objects, and Keita would print them a postcard, and they could send it home to their families to sort of prove that they're being successful, to prove their identity. And so we have the motorcycle. They've actually gone back, and people who understand fashion from that time can date the photos within like a few months because the women are wearing the latest fashion. In all of these photos, there's the watch again, the glasses, the ring. And these are just beautiful, beautiful photos. I'll get to this in a second, but these photos were designed to be put in envelopes and mailed to friends and family, and they've now ended up as big prints and exhibitions around the world. Malik Sidibe, this friend of Keita's, explains that Keita would have never blown these images up so much. He was a perfectionist. He cared about details and the images being as sharp as possible. And when you blow them up, you also see scratches in the film. You would probably not. He's no longer with us. This is sort of what's been done with his work. So this is me and my partner on African Lookbook, Phil Sandick, at his wedding a few years ago. He set up a Seyi Keita photo booth, so we're here proving our identity. And Phil was actually the first person to bring me to Johannesburg. I remember being terrified about 8 years ago. And Phil has a master's degree in oral histories. And that basically means that he's an amazing interviewer. And so when people do sort of a history of Pearl Harbor or Vietnam, and there's still people living among us who can tell the stories of being there, they send someone in like Phil who understands the ethics of trauma and how to approach all these topics that are way over my head. But it's very important, sort of, in the historical realm. And I asked Phil what he thought about conducting oral histories with African artists to allow them to clear any confusion about their work and how it's been received around the world. But one of the things that happens when you do an oral history is you bring either a voice recorder or a video camera and you sort of just let it run. And the less questions that you ask means the better you're doing, the more that that person is sort of sharing with you. So these interviews go on sometimes over multiple sort of sittings for hours at a time. And these bits of people's lives that we learned about turned out to be really fascinating. Some of these alibis had nothing to do with the work that we know them for. Other times it did. And so possibly the most unexpected interview that I got to conduct was with David Goldblatt. If you don't know, David is a photographer who lives here, but his photography has been shown all around the world. He was just given the Hasselblad Award for photography a few years ago at the International Center of Photography in New York, honored him last year. And when I sat down with David, I had no idea that he had studied economics. And he received a business and commerce degree from BITS. And I'm quoting him here. It was the only part-time degree available then, and I've never regretted it. I learned a great deal from it. I became interested in economics and pure economics. At one stage, it was a toss-up whether to become a photographer or an economist, but my maths wasn't good enough to become a professional economist, and in any case, I didn't like the idea of an ivory tower so much as I liked the idea of actually getting down and feeling the grit and the stink, the piss and the smells of South African society. And so he talked about thinking of moving to Israel as a kid, what life was like in the 1940s, and other things that happened long before he was a photographer. And so in studying his 50 years as a photographer in South Africa, it's easy to forget that there was a David Goldblatt before that. If you like short stories, I met our next interview through the 2011 Penn Short Story Award in South Africa. James Wiley, also from Johannesburg, won for his short story called The Short Story. And in 2012, he published his first book of historical fiction with the equally articulate title, The Book of War. And when I sat down with James, I learned that he lost his father when he was 3, his mother when he was in university, which he never finished. Army service was a bit of a fail. He ended up going AWOL, getting sent to the Mad Ward in Bloemfontein. When he came back, and seeing some ugly shit. And so, going to Rhodes, which he never finished, James was interested in acting. And so he told me, I suppose there's a part of me that's always been a writer, and I've never stopped writing. But before I met Heidi, his wife, I hadn't learned to work. We met, we got married, we had children, things became desperate. Actor salaries in South Africa got worse and worse. One was struggling for many years to the point where I had to find a new way of earning money. After a 2-pronged struggle, one being kind of a magazine feature journalist and 2 trying to break into television, I got a job on what was then the first South African soap, EC Dingo, which he says was wonderful. And James is actually still a contributor to EC Dingo, and he says it's taught him a lot about writing. If any of you are a fan. Moving on. An interview that I think sort of got lost in translation literally took place with Senegalese designer Ousmane Ba, and with some of his work. it's hard to see, but the headboard of this bed is made out of shell oil barrel lids. And so with these magnificent barrels, he plays with the politics of precious resources being taken from Africa, as well as exploring how to repurpose the remnants. And so growing up in Dakar, he became like his father, a refrigerator fixer. My job as a frigorist is very rich with experiences. It's a job that has allowed me to encounter a lot of different homes, allowed me to be able to see different bedrooms and living rooms, and that way I've seen lots of different things, lots of different interiors. But working with refrigerators also taught him by most of the skills that he now uses in fabricating his work. And hopefully he'll come to know in the coming year or two. And so looking back at some of these stories, and we've only done 15 of them, Phil and I didn't really uncover whether African artists care about being African or not. But we did get reminded that there's a lot more to creatives than the work that they produce, and that's kind of what it is. Those of you who are creatives here lead other lives. But back in the museum world, we're challenged. Do you present the work? Do you present the story behind that work? How can you make that story available? And so one of my favorite sort of stories about African artists and their creative alibis that are their lives, which has been told well, is about a photographer that I have not interviewed. He was the first that came to mind when I was thinking about this month's theme of hidden. And it took a long time for anyone to find out what he was actually doing. The New York Times calls him the man with 1,000 faces. And this is Samuel Fosso. And Samuel Fosso had probably the worst childhood I can imagine. He was paralyzed until he was about 5 years old. His mother took him to Nigeria, where his grandfather was a healer, and cured him when he was 5 years old. And the story goes that the healing process involved rolling Fosso off of the roof in the sea. But it worked. In 1972, the Biafran War broke out, and Fosso and his mother had to flee. They went to Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic. And at just 13 years old, he had to make a living for himself. And he opened a photography studio, which he still runs to this day, although there's a civil war and he's not in Bangui at home. But he made his living taking portraits, wedding photos, family pictures, and passport photos. But when the shop closed each day, there were often a few images left on his rolls of film. And nobody knew if Fosso would take self-portraits. And remember, he was just a kid escaping a pretty detrimental life. And in his photos, he would assume these other personalities. And I'm actually embarrassed to say I can't. You guys might be better at identifying who he's than me. And so I don't know if we can call these photos selfies. But he's still experimenting to this day with the idea of becoming other people. And so this is a recent work where he's the first Congolese president who was killed, Patrice Lumumba, a golfer, a swimmer. And I think besides the historical gravitas of some of these figures that he's assuming, his work still allows him to escape reality. And so his story is really part of the work. So David Goldblatt, James Wiley, Usman and Ba, I had to ask them about their stories, but I think it paid off. I learned a lot. There's more stories like that. And now the transcripts are available for people to use however they like in research for the press and exhibitions. And I think in a roundabout sort of way, we did answer some of our questions. And so lastly, This is my partner Phil's business card. It's a little cryptic. It doesn't say photographer, oral historian, husband, father, lawyer, all things which he is. In fact, if you flip it over, it just has a name, an email address, and a phone number. And I think it's sort of Phil's way of saying, ask me. Ask me who I am, ask me what I do, ask me how we can connect, how we can start a conversation. And it's an important lesson, not just that everybody has a story to tell, we all know that, they do. But we see people's work, we see their creativity, we compliment it, we collect it, we hire them to make more. But that doesn't mean that we know the whole story. Often there's something more, something hidden.
I mean, this is interesting, and it seems like it was from a kind of previous section of your life. How are you bringing those to South Africa using the...
So the timeline sort of goes that this started 2 years ago. And this is what led to me trying to help designers come up with art. We were meeting people who had products to sell, not necessarily art, but smaller things that we could ship around the world. The stores in the United States were interested in buying, but these guys had no way of getting it there. And so for the last few years, the oral histories have been supported by our company that sells Africa. And each interview takes a couple hours of research once we've sort of identified someone and they've agreed to participate in the project. It takes sort of an introductory meeting to just go over the process, find out maybe if James says it's crazy to strain the army. So before we do that, I went and researched what military service was like in South Africa, so we can talk about that as well. And we come back a few weeks later, we do a 3-hour interview. It gets recorded, someone transcribes it, it takes hours to transcribe. The transcription gets edited by us, we listen to the tape and see that the transcription matches, then we send the transcript back to the artist, and they make their final changes, and then it's done. And so that process takes a long time. And I think we try to come up with every kind of way around doing all of that tedious work. I think we're a little exhausted by it, but it's something that I think we now probably, between us, we each do about 3 a year. Phil's a lawyer now, and a father, he wasn't at the time. And I'm here, and so it's tough. If anybody wants to help now. It would be amazing if Mo eventually had a recording studio for this and proper library or his archive. Luckily, because we both have this tie to Columbia University and they have the biggest oral history archive in the world, the interviews sit there. And so they are accessible. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Great talk. Why did you decide to use the word design in museums title that shows photography and...
Well, that's what was fun for me today. My background is sort of in art history. So this stuff has nothing to do with the museum per se. But at the same time, we did have a photography show, Common Lives, that explored design. And I think it brings up this question which I kind of struggle with right now, which is what is art, what is design, where do you draw the line? And a lot of artists are doing design work, and a lot of designers are doing artwork. And it stems from all sorts of different things, from sculpture, artists that want to try designing something that they can sell, or to solve some sort of solution. Just sort of, I think while a lot of African artists, not the ones that I've shown necessarily, are maybe fine artists, but they're surrounded by some of Africa's problems, and so they try to create some sort of design solution. And that's where some of our work is. Others is multimedia design, is graphic design, art. We play with this all the time. And so that's what makes mode sort of fun for me, and I think other people hate it. But I'm sort of open to anything. Yeah.
I'm just curious why you decided to move to journalism.
Why did I want to move to journalism? Well, I've been coming here for this work, and as a freelance journalist, that's how I met a lot of these artists in the first place. I carried a camera as the white guy around Africa for many years, and that was sort of on the back of coming here because of the film. The Gods Must Be Crazy, and making a documentary about it. So I was the white guy with the camera in the middle of Africa, who people were running into to get paid for the pictures, or wanted help, or wanted a visa back to the United States. And what was more interesting to me, I just saw his calendar. What was more interesting to me was meeting the artists and the creatives that could have been doing what I was doing. I wasn't doing a very good job of it either. I was making promotional films for nonprofits in Congo, in Tanzania, and Kenya. And everywhere I went, being the guy holding the camera, everybody was like, "Oh, you have to meet John Rungo. He's just finished the first feature film in Congo." I was like, "Wow, that's amazing. It's nothing to do with why I'm here, but I want to meet him." And so that's why I ended up going to Columbia, studying African art history, and I had the amazing opportunity to come to WITS for a year and study African literature. And that's when I found out that mode was an idea. And so mode is in Mopton Precinct. It's an old factory. It's been sort of set aside for a few years as a design museum. And so we started workshopping about a year and a half ago what it would mean to open a design museum. And a design museum in a place where nobody cares about museums. The museums in South Africa don't have much foot traffic, they don't have much funding. Kind of on the surface looked like a stupid idea to open a museum. And so that's why you see that we have all these sort of crazy programs and weird things that sound like a museum and concerts. And yeah, I think it's exciting. It's fun. I'm not the curator, I'm not the sort of PhD that knows all of the stuff inside and out, but I enjoy meeting people and sort of bringing them in the space and seeing what they can do. So, yeah.
What is your 10-year vision or 5-year vision for the work?
So if you've been to Mode, you'll know that we sort of just have an empty space. So I think the next step, there's a lot of projects happening this year, but the next step is really to formalize it as a museum. To look at having a permanent collection so that there's never, right now we're visiting exhibitions, so if we're between exhibitions, there's nothing to see, which is sort of a shame. So we do want to have a permanent exhibition, and that sort of is a much bigger conversation about what is African design. Again, is it art, is it design, is it, it's crazy actually to try to pinpoint how we go about that, and I don't think we know yet. So I think that's the long-term vision. This year, though, we're opening a makerspace where people can come and use a 3D printer or a CNC machine or learn a new skill, so designers can come and collaborate. And we're also working with the bar guys upstairs to open a speakeasy. And it's actually sort of a permanent installation. Maybe it's our first permanent collection, but the speakeasy is a cocktail bar, except it comes from Prohibition in America. So when people weren't allowed to drink in the 1920s, they built these hidden bars. And so the museum's going to have a hidden bar in the basement, and we're going to do sort of an exhibition within it about the Prohibition idea in Africa. So photographers who were taking pictures of people dancing to James Brown in Mali in the 50s when James Brown was outlawed, or Shebeen culture in South Africa. And so I think at the moment we're a little obsessed with alcohol. But it gets people in the building and it's fun. So there's some immediate things happening this year, and there's some things that are more long-term.
Have you decided to turn a bathroom to get out of here?
Yes, we overlooked the fact that to have alcohol, you have to have food. So if anybody enjoys cooking, approach us. It's Dino who runs one of the bars and is sitting in the back. Does not. Yeah.
My real question to you is, what is your vision for a permanent collection? I mean, like, I know you said you don't really know until all of this, but your personal, what would be the first piece that you would like to acquire for a museum like this, if I can look something like this?
At the moment, the challenge for me is the way that we attract the most people is sort of contemporary work. And Africa has this amazing history of design. In fact, the history of African art is uniquely, compared to other sort of parts of the world, tied to design. And the fact that African art started out as ethnography, and collectors like the Rockefellers had the biggest collection of African art objects. So they didn't call it art, they called it objects of daily life and ethnography, and anthropologists were the ones going around Africa collecting these objects. And at the Brooklyn Museum in the 1920s, this curator had this crazy idea. I'm going to display this collection that's just been given to us by the Rockefeller family as art. That was not even 100 years ago. And so African art has sort of taken off. And I think right now it's one of the most exciting sort of bits of the contemporary art world. And that's what people are more excited about, maybe than some of the older pieces. And so this idea of design is even newer. If art was ethnography until 90 years ago, we haven't thought about art as design until maybe the last 10 years, thanks to places like Fada, which have one of the few design schools in Africa. And so we have to figure out if our permanent collection is going to be about the history of design and ethnographic objects, which are now art and could be design, things like power objects from Congo, which are displayed in Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, but it's really a sculpture and it has a design purpose, it has a function in life, in sort of Congolese belief, is that a design object. And at the same time, I think we'll get a lot more traction and visitors if we have contemporary work. And that's sort of what a director and a curator has to think about, how do we get people through the door. And if we have contemporary work, how long is it contemporary for? We sell it after 5 years and start from scratch. So this will be a process for the next year, I think, sort of workshopping some of these ideas. And probably having some discussions with the public if people want to pitch in. Yeah.
Two questions. Firstly, it's really great that Rome exists. I think it's well awaited and it's about time, I wish there were more. The question is, I've got two problems with galleries and museums, Johannesburg and South Africa and probably Africa, is that the majority of people don't go to them, and funding. So, are you approaching, do you have any strategies of appealing to the market that doesn't go to galleries and museums and welcoming them in? And then the other question is, who's funding them? Who's behind the scenes? How are you sustaining yourself?
I think it's actually the question, I don't know if everybody can get the question is, how do we get people who don't go to museums to come, and how do we pay for everything? And I think in some ways we've turned it into the same question, and we approach brands like South African breweries and tell them, we have the coolest, youngest, hippest people coming back into Johannesburg, and they're lawyers and they're doctors and they're investment bankers, and they care about being design conscious. They want to buy a new body because it's designed well. So we play with things like that, and that's where our funding comes from corporate sponsors. And there's sponsors that fund the museum's operations, and there's sponsors that fund individual exhibitions. And that's one market, which is exciting to get people from Santa, from Pretoria, from parts of Gauteng that are now coming into the city, back into the city, and doing that through the arts. And I think my goal, we've thought about this a lot with other museum directors in the city, is that if mode can be sort of a gateway drug, a gateway museum, then maybe people will think about going to Johannesburg Art Gallery in Hillbrow, which has Picasso and Kandinsky and Mays sitting in a vault in Hillbrow. So if mode can sort of fill that role, that's great. The other side of that is we don't just want sort of influencers and people who are going to buy luxury products coming to Mode. We want to open it up to South Africans at large. Obviously, that's a small sector of the population. So, for instance, Mercedes is paying for an exhibition that will take place from Youth Day in June through mid-August, and they're also paying for a Mercedes bus that will bring school groups there every day, and get kids thinking about design and sort of exposed to the museum experience. And I think that's going to be really exciting. It's something I know nothing about, so this is an experiment for us.
Just an offshoot from that, I'm at this gallery, I'm starting to play with how do you move away from a bit of a westernized model, which is what galleries are based on, to be a bit more Africanized in what you serve, in drinks and food and music, in the cultural dynamics, so that majority of this country will still become interested in the gallery scene, but perhaps they're not interested because it's such a westernized concept. Is there any ways that you're trying to Africanize what a gallery and museum is?
No. I think design museums are new around the world, so nobody really knows what they are. But for us to consciously try to figure out what African is never going to happen. The multitude of cultures, the multitude of languages, and kinds of things that are going on. I don't know that it is uniquely different necessarily. And I mean, it goes back to, is El Mansuri an African artist or is he an artist? And he doesn't care how people are doing. People like Chinua Achebe, the famous writer from Nigeria, he does care. He gave a speech like this at Harvard and just nailed this Ghanaian writer, Amin Kweyarma, for not selling his book in Ghana, even though it took place in Ghana. He said it wasn't African enough, that the names were too generic and the story wasn't a real story. And so it's a debate that's been going on for a long time. How do you tackle African as a sort of entity? And I think it's more important, and I could definitely be wrong. I think it's more important to just look at who you're trying to attract to a museum and find ways of bringing them in. It will be different than maybe the typical Western way, but I don't think that necessarily means it's that.
Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you guys.